Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4566, the Alleviating Stress Test Burdens to Help Investors Act. And I especially want to thank the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin, one of the most hard-working, enthusiastic, cheerful members of the House Financial Services Committee, for all the work that he has done to advance this very strong piece of bipartisan legislation, which incidentally, Mr. Speaker, passed the Financial Services Committee again with another strong bipartisan vote of 47-8. Now, the financial crisis led to questions both domestically and internationally about how to address financial stability and create a regulatory framework to mitigate systemic risk, all the while ensuring robust economic growth. At the heart of this bill of the gentleman from Maine is a recognition that our economy can suffer when we get it wrong, when government attempts to dictate the business models and operational objectives of so many of our businesses. And it's also a recognition that one-size-fits-all regulations can stifle economic growth and harm consumers, harm our constituents. Current bank-centric standards and assessments to non-bank industries, such as the asset management industry, have needlessly saddled Main Street investors with increased cost while they are trying to save for college or retirement or some other important need. And this is perhaps no clearer than in the stress testing regime. As a former SEC chief economist observed in 2016, who said that in the current law, quote, stress test the big banks. And you might as well go ahead and do the asset management companies, unquote. That is his take of what the law says. In other words, asset management firms that, again, our constituents depend upon for their retirement security, for their financial planning, they are now subject to bank regulations simply because they operate under the financial services umbrella, even though such firms plainly have legal, structural, and operational characteristics that make them very, very different from banks. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, none of the asset managers had anything to do with the financial crisis that brought about the legislation that we are debating in the first place. For example, unlike banks, asset managers do not have access to the Deposit Insurance Fund or the Fed's discount window. And if that's not enough for you, Mr. Speaker, here's more. Asset managers are legally separated from the funds they manage, meaning that the assets and liabilities of the manager are distinct from the assets and liabilities of the funds. On the other hand, the bank business model directly subjects the bank to the risk and obligations of its assets and liabilities. Again, applying a one-size-fits-all regulatory structure, in this case a bank-centric model, is not only bad for the asset management industry, but far more importantly, for our constituents that they serve who choose to save and invest. Registered funds are the investment vehicle choices for millions of Americans seeking to buy a home, pay for college, plan for financial security and retirement. Application of unnecessary, ill-suited, bank-centric stress testing requirements to registered funds and advisors will undoubtedly increase costs for these funds and advisors, and ultimately this gets passed on to investors without any corresponding benefits that we can discern. The recent asset management and insurance report issued by the Department of Treasury confirms these concerns. The gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin's bill, would fix this unequal regulatory structure by exempting certain non-bank financial institutions that have not been designated for supervision by the Federal Reserve Board from the Act's stress testing requirements. Further, in the true spirit of bipartisanship, I want to thank the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, for recognizing the underlying need for this relief and working with Mr. Poliquin to offer an amendment during markup that allows the SEC and the CFTC to issue regulations to require certain financial companies they supervise to conduct periodic analysis of the financial condition of such companies under adverse economic conditions. The approach is common sense. It is not one size fits all. It recognizes that the primary regulator of non-bank financial companies is better suited than a bank regulator to determine whether these stress tests might be useful to address risk. And it recognizes that as a general matter, stress testing asset managers is difficult and often needless. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge all of my colleagues to support this great bipartisan legislation. I believe we have an amendment forthcoming from the ranking member, which I expect our side of the aisle to support, and I am led to believe that with the adoption of her amendment, that she would support the underlying bill. So I hope that proves to come to fruition, in which case we can have a very strong bipartisan vote on this bill, and I reserve the balance.